The mission began with calm voices and steady hands. The small exploration ship drifted out of lunar orbit, its hull gleaming in the sunlight. It wasn't a warship or a luxury vessel, just a survey craft sent to scan new systems and record data. The crew was made up of people from different countries, all trained, all experienced, all proud to be part of humanity's great expansion beyond the stars. It was supposed to be a short journey, 6 weeks there and back. A simple mapping run, collect samples, run surface scans, and return home to the rotating lights of Earth. Every one of them expected to come back with stories to tell and new badges to add to their records. None of them imagined the silence that waited ahead. For the first week, everything worked as planned. The engines purred quietly, the data streams flowed into the consoles, and the view outside was endless, black and beautiful. The crew worked in pairs, taking turns on watch and talking about the little things that made the distance feel shorter. Someone joked that space looked peaceful only because sound couldn't travel through it. They laughed. Then, in one heartbeat, that peace ended. The meteor storm came out of nowhere. At first, the sensors showed faint readings, small flashes like static. Then the ship jolted hard enough to throw the crew against the walls. The sound was like metal being crushed underwater. The lights flickered, alarms screamed, and one by one systems began to shut down. The ship spun out of control before the stabilizers kicked in. Inside the control deck, everyone worked fast. The crew secured damaged panels, sealed a small hull breach, and reconnected life support manually. They managed to stop the spinning, but when they checked the main reactor, the readouts were red. The storm had pierced through the outer hull and into the core housing. The reactor wasn't destroyed, but it was bleeding power fast. The captain stayed calm, giving orders in a voice that didn't shake. The others followed, trusting that calmness. They rerouted power to life support and sealed the reactor chamber. The ship's AI tried to reconnect the beacon to send a distress signal back to Earth Command. At first it worked. The signal went out. Then static filled the comms. The beacon flickered and went silent. The engineer tried again, connecting the backup transmitter, but it barely reached half power. The signal stretched a few million kilometers before fading into static. No one knew if anyone heard them. Hours passed. Then a day. Then 2. The ship was stable but drifting, slowly, aimlessly, across the empty dark. They had power for air and heat, but not enough to change course. The engines were shut down to save energy. The captain gathered the crew in the main compartment. The light was dim, a faint yellow glow from emergency lamps. They sat in silence until the captain spoke. The words were calm but heavy. The ship was damaged beyond what they could repair out here. They were officially stranded. They all understood what that meant. They didn't panic, not at first. They were trained for emergencies. They began rationing supplies, checking systems, and keeping logs. They still believed help would come. The distress signal had gone out for a few minutes. Someone had to have picked it up. They just needed to wait. Days turned into weeks. The waiting became harder. The stars outside never moved. The same black horizon stared back every time someone looked out the viewing window. The silence of space began to feel alive, like something pressing in from all sides. The crew tried to keep busy. They cleaned the ship, tested systems that no longer mattered, and recorded log entries that no one might ever read. The medical officer made sure everyone drank their share of water, even when they wanted to save it. The youngest member of the crew stopped speaking much. Sometimes they just sat near the window, staring into the endless dark. After 20 days, their power reserves dropped to half. The engineer suggested shutting down all non-essential systems, leaving only the oxygen scrubbers, heat generators, and comms active. They agreed. The ship dimmed further, lights flickering as if it was falling asleep. The silence deepened. Messages were still being sent out, short, desperate bursts of digital sound. But the universe stayed quiet. No response, no acknowledgement. The captain checked every frequency known to humankind and some that weren't. Nothing. One night the crew gathered again. The air felt colder, thinner. The captain told them what they already knew. Earth Command hadn't answered. The colonies hadn't either. They were too far, too small, too forgotten. The captain didn't say it out loud, but the look said it all. No one was coming. They didn't cry. They didn't shout. They just sat there, breathing the recycled air and listening to the hum of the failing life support unit. The engineer tried one more time to repair the beacon, burning his hands on overheated panels. The light flickered weakly, sending a single pulse into the dark. Then it died again. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing in some compartments. The crew moved closer to the core section, using thermal blankets and heat packs to stay alive. They spoke less now. Each word seemed to cost energy they didn't have. When the next day came, they stopped counting the hours. The walls were cold to the touch. Frost gathered along the metal edges. One by one, the lights went out as power reserves ran low. Only the emergency panel stayed lit, glowing faint blue. They still recorded log entries, even when no one would hear them. The captain's last one that day was short and steady. Power critical, attempting to maintain signal manually. Then the screen dimmed and the sound of the air filters filled the silence. The crew took turns cranking the manual generator to keep minimal power for the comms. Their hands bled from the effort. It gave them something to do, something that felt like hope. Even if no one was listening, they wanted the universe to know they tried. Days later, one of them asked quietly, "Do you think Earth even knows we're alive?" No one answered. Outside, space was completely still. No ships, no signals, nothing. Just the silent drift of the damaged vessel, floating between the stars like a forgotten memory. Inside, life had become a rhythm of breathing, checking gauges, and waiting. The waiting was the worst. It made time lose meaning. They dreamed of sunlight, wind, the sound of rain on Earth. They would wake up and see only cold metal walls. By the end of the second month, the oxygen scrubbers began to fail. The filters were old, and the replacement cartridges were used up. Breathing became harder, slower. The engineer dismantled unused parts of the ship to build makeshift filters, but they didn't last long. They were exhausted, hungry, fading. Yet every time the generator spun and a weak signal went out, a spark of hope returned. Maybe someone somewhere would hear it, but deep down they knew the truth. In all the vast emptiness around them, they were alone. Then, something strange happened. The youngest crew member, who hadn't spoken in days, was sitting near the comms console when the static changed. It was faint, almost lost in noise, but there was something there. A pattern. A pulse. They called the captain. Everyone gathered around, staring at the faint flicker on the monitor. The signal was too weak to decode, but it was real. It was something. The captain leaned forward and whispered, "Keep it locked. Boost it." The engineer rerouted power from the last remaining lights. The hum of the ship deepened as the comms drew every remaining bit of energy. The static grew louder. Then, through the noise, a faint tone repeated. It wasn't one of theirs. It wasn't a known rescue frequency either. But it had rhythm. It had structure. The captain stared at the data feed. "That's human code," they said quietly. For the first time in weeks, hope filled the room. The crew sat there in the dim light, shivering, exhausted but alive, listening to that faint, impossible signal echoing across the stars. After so long in silence, someone had heard them. They didn't know who it was or where it came from. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. The human ship was still far away. The message was weak and uncertain, but for the stranded crew it was more than a signal. It was a heartbeat in the dark, a promise that they weren't forgotten. And though they didn't know it yet, that tiny pulse of sound would soon change everything. They were not alone anymore. For a few seconds no one moved. The signal was faint, almost lost under the static, but it was real. They had been in silence for so long that even a whisper of sound felt like thunder. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to match the rhythm of the flickering light on the console. The captain leaned closer, watching the weak pulse blink on the screen. The engineer adjusted the frequency again, hands trembling from exhaustion. The sound crackled, dipped, and then rose again. It was like someone far away was trying to speak through a storm. At first, they thought it might just be interference. a random cosmic echo bouncing from a far-off source. But then the pattern repeated exactly the same way again and again every few seconds. That meant intention. That meant intelligence, and that meant hope. No one dared to say it out loud. Hope was dangerous now. It could lift them up one second and crush them the next. But even as they tried to stay calm, their eyes were bright again. They boosted power to the receiver, draining what little energy was left from the heating system. The cold crept back through the metal walls, but no one cared. All focus was on the sound. After a long minute, the pattern changed. It wasn't random anymore, it was a message. The computer tried to decode it, but the system kept freezing from low power. So the captain ordered manual translation. They listened carefully to the rhythm, short bursts and long pauses. It was old human code, hardly used anymore, but still remembered by those who studied early space transmissions. One of the crew members whispered the translation slowly as the message came through. "We received your signal. Hold position. We're coming." Everyone froze again. The words hung in the air, soft and unreal. Someone was coming. The captain exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The engineer covered their face and laughed quietly, a sound mixed with disbelief and relief. The youngest crew member smiled for the first time since the storm hit, but there was still one problem. They didn't know who had sent it. The frequency didn't match any official Earth rescue channel. It wasn't from a government ship or a military patrol. The signal was too weak, too personal, as if it came from a smaller, older vessel. But it didn't matter. Whoever it was, they were human, and they had heard them. The captain quickly organized tasks. They began preparing the ship's beacon to stay locked onto the signal's direction. The engineer recalibrated the navigation sensors to estimate the source. The others gathered in the control deck, watching the numbers shift on the display. After a few hours of tracking, the direction became clear. The signal came from a point far beyond their original route, almost beyond the mapped boundaries of known travel lanes. Whoever was answering wasn't nearby. They were coming from a place no official ship would normally pass. The journey to reach them could take days, maybe weeks. And the stranded crew didn't have weeks left. The captain understood this, but didn't say it out loud. Instead, they focused everyone on survival tasks, preserving oxygen, recycling water, reducing power consumption even more. They couldn't move the ship, but they could make sure it stayed alive long enough for rescue to arrive. Time began to crawl again. Hours turned into long stretches of waiting and checking, waiting and breathing, waiting and hoping. The crew started listening to the signal every few hours just to hear that faint, rhythmic pulse. Each time it came through a little stronger. The rescuer was getting closer. In the meantime, the crew grew weaker. Food was almost gone and the air had grown heavy. The filters were at their limit. Their bodies ached from the cold, and sleep was shallow and restless. But whenever someone started losing strength, the captain reminded them of the voice, the words that had cut through the silence. "We're coming." That was enough to keep them going. Then one cycle later, the signal changed again. The computer barely caught it, but when the translation finished, it said, "Approaching system edge. Prepare beacon for lock." That was it. Someone was truly out there coming for them. They worked through the fatigue, restoring what little power they could to the external transmitters. The ship's outer lights flickered to life for the first time in weeks. Small beams of light stretched into the darkness like the ship itself was trying to reach out and guide the incoming savior. Still, there was fear. What if the rescue ship couldn't find them in time? What if it ran out of fuel? What if the signal was lost again? Space was vast and their vessel was nothing more than a drifting dot. But every fear was met with a single quiet answer from the captain. "They found us once. They'll find us again." Another day passed, then another. The crew took turns sitting near the window, hoping to see something, anything beyond the darkness. Every flicker of light made their hearts jump, but it was only distant stars. Then, during one long and silent night cycle, the engineer noticed something strange. The static background noise on the receiver was changing pitch. It was becoming stronger, sharper, clearer. Everyone gathered again around the console. The tone kept rising. It was the sound of an approaching transmission, closer, louder. Then came a voice. Faint, shaky, but real. "This is the Horizon Dawn. Hold position." "We're almost within range," the room erupted. No one could believe it. Some laughed, others cried silently. After all the silence, hearing another human voice felt unreal, like a dream. The captain leaned toward the mic and answered in a steady tone, even though their voice trembled. "This is the stranded vessel Orion Venture. We copy your signal. Systems critical. Life support failing. Coordinates locked. Please hurry." Static crackled, then the reply came. "We've got you. Don't lose hope. You're not alone out there." The crew looked at each other, tears shining in their tired eyes. Those words, simple, ordinary words, felt like a rescue in themselves. The Horizon Dawn wasn't an official rescue ship. It was a civilian freighter, privately owned, not bound by command rules. The pilot must have gone off route, risking everything to come this far. But to the stranded crew, it didn't matter who they were. What mattered was that they cared. The following hours were the longest of their lives. The ship's oxygen was running low. Each breath came heavier. The walls were coated with frost again, and their lights were fading. The temperature dropped to the point where their breath turned into mist. They kept sending weak pings every few minutes to guide the incoming ship. The Horizon Dawn responded with steady updates, its signal growing stronger with each hour. Finally, one of the scanners caught a faint light in the distance. At first, they thought it was another star, but then it moved. It was coming straight toward them. No one spoke. They just watched that tiny light grow bigger. The computer read the distance closing fast. Then a soft tremor shook the ship. It wasn't damage. It was the gentle vibration of another vessel approaching. They could see it now through the frost-covered window, a dark shape emerging from the blackness, with a single white beacon glowing like a star that had come alive. The captain's voice cracked as they whispered, "They found us." The Horizon Dawn stopped a few hundred meters away, its massive silhouette shining against the emptiness. Small thrusters fired as it adjusted position. Then a message came through again. "Hold steady. We're coming aboard." The stranded crew moved as quickly as their weak bodies allowed. They gathered emergency packs, secured what little they had left, and waited near the main hatch. The sound of metal locking against metal echoed through the corridor as the rescue clamps engaged. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then the airlock door hissed open. A flood of bright light poured into the dark corridor, and standing there were humans, fellow travelers from the same distant home, faces covered with helmets, voices calm but full of life. The first words they spoke were simple, "You're safe now." For the survivors, those words meant everything. After so many silent days, after so much darkness and fear, they were finally heard, finally seen. They had been left to die in the emptiness of space, forgotten by command, but not by humanity. Someone, just one human ship, had answered the call, and that changed everything. The airlock opened with a heavy hiss, and for the first time in weeks, the crew saw something new. Light. Bright white light poured into the narrow corridor, cutting through the gloom that had surrounded them for so long. It was almost blinding, like sunlight after a storm. The rescuers stepped through carefully. Their suits were thick, their movements calm and steady. The sound of their boots against the metal floor echoed through the quiet ship. One of them lifted a small scanner, checking the air and temperature. Another carried a thermal pack, already reaching out to help. No one from the stranded crew spoke at first. They just stood there staring, breathing fast as if afraid this might be a dream that would vanish if they moved too quickly. The cold air hit their lungs, but they didn't care. They could feel warmth returning, not from the heaters, but from the presence of other human beings. The lead rescuer gave a small nod, and a soft voice came through the helmet speaker. "We've got you. Let's get you home." Those words broke the silence that had weighed on the ship for weeks. One of the crew members finally let out a shaky laugh. Another began to cry quietly. The captain, who had held everything together for so long, simply whispered, "Thank you." There wasn't time to talk much. The rescuers moved quickly and carefully. They handed out oxygen packs and small hydration tubes. They wrapped the weakest crew members in insulated blankets. Then, with practiced motions, they began transferring them to the rescue vessel one by one. The corridors of the damaged ship were narrow and cold, frost glistening on every surface. The rescuers had to move slowly to avoid disturbing fragile wiring and cracked panels. Every step echoed. Every breath sounded loud. Yet under all the exhaustion and fear, a quiet feeling spread among everyone. The feeling that they were going to live. As the first group crossed into the Horizon Dawn, they were greeted by a wave of warm air. The rescue ship had functioning heat, clean air, and light, simple things that suddenly felt like miracles. The survivors could hardly walk. Their muscles were weak, their bodies light from hunger and fatigue. The rescuers guided them to seats and began checking their vitals. The medic on board worked fast, adjusting oxygen levels and wrapping cold hands in heated gloves. The survivors' faces were pale, but color slowly returned. They were given small sips of nutrient water. Some closed their eyes, overwhelmed. Back in the stranded ship, the captain refused to leave until everyone else was safe. They helped guide the last 2 crew members through the narrow passage. The rescuers respected that quiet strength. When the final crew member crossed the airlock, the captain turned for one last look at the vessel that had carried them through the dark. The ship was damaged, frozen, and drifting, but it had protected them long enough for this moment to happen. The captain gave a small nod, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, and stepped through the hatch. The airlock sealed behind them. When it closed, the world changed. The silence that had haunted them for so long was replaced by the steady hum of engines and the gentle vibrations of a ship alive with power. It was a sound they had almost forgotten, the sound of safety, the sound of life continuing. Inside the Horizon Dawn, the survivors sat quietly, wrapped in blankets, their bodies shaking, not from cold anymore, but from the flood of emotion. One of the rescuers placed a warm drink in their hands. The captain of the stranded crew looked around the bright interior, their eyes glistening. "You came for us," they said softly. The pilot of the Horizon Dawn removed their helmet and gave a tired smile. "No one deserves to be left behind," they replied. For a while, no one spoke. The hum of the engines filled the silence. The survivors just sat there, holding on to that simple truth. Later, the rescuers began sharing how they had found them. The Horizon Dawn had been on a transport route far from official space lanes, carrying supplies between outer colonies. When they caught the faint distress pulse, they almost ignored it. It was weak, unstable, something most ships would assume was interference. But the pilot decided to check it anyway. Something about the signal pattern felt too human to ignore. They rerouted their course, burning through extra fuel they couldn't afford to waste, and spent days searching through empty sectors with no guarantee of finding anything. But they kept going, guided only by the fading beacon. And then finally, their scanners caught the drifting shape of the Orion Venture. The survivors listened to the story in silence, amazed that someone had taken that risk just for them. The captain tried to thank the pilot again, but the rescuer only shook their head. "We couldn't just fly past. If it was us out there, we'd hope someone would do the same." That single line carried more power than any medal or award could ever give. The crew began to recover slowly. The doctor aboard Horizon Dawn monitored them around the clock. Some of them could barely stand, but every hour they grew a little stronger. The warmth, the food, and the simple sound of voices lifted their spirits. They were alive, and that was more than enough. Outside the viewing window, the frozen shell of their old ship drifted quietly into the distance. It looked small now, almost fragile, swallowed by the endless dark. The captain watched it disappear, whispering under their breath, "You kept us alive. Thank you." Soon the rescue ship prepared for the long journey back toward inhabited space. They didn't have much fuel left, and they had to plan carefully. Every calculation mattered. The pilot rerouted power from secondary systems to extend the range. The crew worked together, even the weakened survivors helping where they could. They were determined not to waste the second chance they'd been given. The first few days of the return were tense. The Horizon Dawn wasn't built for deep space rescues. It was a freighter, strong but slow. The added weight and power strain pushed its engines to their limit. The engineer kept checking the readings, adjusting output to prevent overheating. The rescued crew watched quietly, knowing how much was being risked for them. Then came a minor crisis. A navigation relay began to fail, causing the ship to drift slightly off course. The pilot worked through the night cycle, manually correcting the trajectory. It was exhausting work, but no one complained. Every person on that ship understood what was at stake. Through all of it, there was a strange calm on board. Fear had turned into focus. Despair had turned into unity. They were no longer just survivors and rescuers. They were one crew, bound by the same fight for survival. At mealtimes, they sat together in the small galley, sharing quiet conversations. The rescued crew spoke about what it felt like in the dark, the endless waiting, the silence, the thought that no one was coming. The rescuers listened, eyes filled with understanding. Then one of them said, "That's why we came. Because no one should ever feel that alone." That simple statement silenced the room. It reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest act of bravery isn't fighting a war. It's answering a call that no one else dares to answer. As the ship continued its slow journey home, the survivors began keeping logs again, not out of duty this time, but out of gratitude. They wanted to record everything: the fear, the waiting, and the moment the light came through the dark. They wanted others to know that even in the cold emptiness of space, humanity still cared. After several long days, the stars outside began to shift. They had crossed into the outer edge of the nearest inhabited zone. The rescue ship sent out a signal to Earth Command, one that would finally be heard. The response came quickly this time. "This is Earth Command Control. Horizon Dawn, we copy. Identify your cargo and survivors." The pilot smiled faintly and replied, "Cargo, human lives. Status, alive and coming home." The communication room fell silent again, but this time it was a peaceful silence, a silence that meant it was over. The survivors looked out the window at the distant blue shimmer of Earth far ahead. After so much time drifting in darkness, they could finally see home again. In the dim light of the control deck, the captain turned to the pilot and whispered, "You didn't have to come for us." The pilot smiled gently. "Maybe not, but that's what makes us human." And in that small, quiet moment, surrounded by stars, everyone understood the truth. The universe could be cold and endless, but compassion, the simple act of caring for one another, was the light that kept humanity alive. They had been left to die. But one ship, one crew had chosen to care, and that choice had changed everything. The return journey felt longer than it really was. Time had changed for them. Every second now carried weight. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance at the glowing console. The hum of the Horizon Dawn's engines filled the air, steady and alive. It was the sound of hope pulling them home. The survivors sat together in the small observation deck, wrapped in warm blankets. Outside, space stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt like a prison. The darkness seemed softer now because somewhere ahead there was light. There was Earth. For days, no one spoke much. They didn't need to. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful. Each person was lost in thought, remembering everything they'd endured, the moments when they had given up, the moments when they'd held on. The captain often stood by the window, watching the faint shimmer of stars. They looked tired, older than before, but their eyes had that calm strength again, the same strength that had kept everyone alive through the worst. The pilot of the Horizon Dawn spent most of the time in the control room, focused on keeping the ship stable. They'd used too much fuel during the rescue. Every calculation mattered. Every small correction could mean the difference between reaching home or drifting short. There were moments when the power flickered or the engines groaned, and the survivors would look up in fear. But the pilot would simply say, "We're fine. Just another bump on the way home." The steady tone always eased their hearts. On the 5th day of the return, Earth Command finally sent a full confirmation message. The transmission crackled through the comms. "Horizon Dawn, your signal is confirmed. Rescue mission received. You are authorized for immediate approach to orbital dock once within range." The words brought silence to the room, then quiet laughter. Some couldn't believe it. For so long, they'd been certain no one would ever say those words to them again. That night, the crew gathered around a small table in the galley. It wasn't a feast, just heated meal packs, but it felt like a celebration. They shared stories softly, voices warm, sometimes breaking into small smiles. One of them said, "I used to think space was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. But now it feels more dangerous than beautiful." Another replied gently, "It's still beautiful. It just reminds us that we're small and that we need each other." Those words stayed with them long after the meal ended. A few days later, the stars began to shift again. The navigation system showed they were entering Earth's transmission range. The planet was still far, but now sensors could pick up signals, radio chatter, data bursts, the living heartbeat of civilization. For the survivors, it was overwhelming. They had been cut off from the human voice for so long that the sudden flood of sound felt unreal. They listened in silence as the communication feed came alive with familiar tones and languages. It was like hearing the pulse of humanity again. The captain closed their eyes and whispered, "We're home." But the journey wasn't over yet. The Horizon Dawn was running on minimal fuel. The engines were overheating. The ship's systems weren't built for such a long rescue run. The pilot called for a quiet meeting. The survivors gathered, sensing something serious. The pilot explained that they would need to shut down one of the main engines temporarily to prevent a full system failure. It meant the return would take longer. The crew didn't complain. No one argued. They'd already been through worse. Waiting a few more hours, even days, was nothing compared to the silence they'd escaped. The engineer and medic worked side by side to balance power between life support and propulsion. Everyone helped in small ways, carrying tools, monitoring readouts, doing whatever they could to lighten the workload. The air grew warm again as the engine core stabilized. The ship shook lightly but kept moving. Outside, the stars began to thin, replaced by faint traces of reflected light. The sensors detected the glow of satellites, tiny human-made dots moving around Earth's orbit. That sight made everyone breathe a little easier. They were close. The pilot sent one final message to Earth Command. "Approaching outer orbit. Request docking coordinates." The reply came instantly. "Coordinates locked. You're cleared for priority entry. Welcome home." That phrase, "welcome home," echoed in their minds. For some, it brought tears they couldn't hold back. When Earth came into view, the entire crew gathered at the observation deck. No one spoke. The planet hung before them like a blue jewel, glowing against the blackness. Clouds moved softly across its surface, white and calm. The sight of it filled the cabin with quiet awe. The youngest survivor pressed a hand against the glass, whispering, "I thought I'd never see it again." No one corrected them. They all felt the same. As the ship entered the upper orbit, communication centers across the planet picked up their signal. News of their survival spread fast. Civilian channels lit up with reports of the rescue. Messages poured in, people sending gratitude, relief, even tears. By the time the Horizon Dawn reached the docking station, hundreds of eyes were watching from across the world. Cameras, reporters, and ordinary people waited for the ship that had done what no official fleet had done, gone beyond protocol to save lives. The docking process was slow and careful. The ship shuddered slightly as the clamps connected. Then, after a moment that felt like forever, the doors opened. The air that came through was fresh, warm, and familiar. The survivors stepped out one by one, blinking against the bright light. Their faces were pale and thin, but alive. The sound of voices, real human voices, filled the air around them. Medical teams rushed forward, but they didn't push or overwhelm. They moved gently, offering support, checking vitals, guiding the survivors toward the care stations. The captain paused at the threshold, looking back once more at the Horizon Dawn. The pilot stood nearby, tired but smiling. Without words, they shared a look of understanding, something that went beyond gratitude. It was respect. It was shared humanity. As news spread, the world reacted with astonishment. People couldn't stop talking about the freighter that had gone off route, risking everything to bring home the forgotten. Reporters tried to reach the pilot for statements, but the pilot avoided interviews. They didn't see themselves as a hero. When someone finally asked why they had done it, the pilot simply said, "Because I couldn't ignore the call." That's all. Those few words echoed across the planet. They were printed, quoted, replayed, and remembered. The rescued crew spent weeks recovering. The medical team said their survival was almost impossible given the conditions. Yet they made it because one ship, one crew, chose compassion over command. Later, when they were strong enough, the survivors gathered again, not in space this time, but under the soft light of Earth's sky. They visited the flight center where the Horizon Dawn was being repaired. The ship's hull was scorched and battered, but still standing, a symbol of what courage could look like. Someone suggested painting a message on the side before its next mission. The captain smiled and agreed. Together they wrote a line in simple white paint. "No one is left behind." People who saw it later would stop and stare. Some would feel a lump in their throat. Others would whisper it quietly, as if reminding themselves of something they already knew deep down. The story spread beyond Earth, across colonies and outposts, carried in broadcasts and shared in quiet conversations. It became a reminder that humanity's strength didn't come from its technology or its weapons, but from its heart, from the will to care for one another even when it wasn't easy, even when no one else was watching. Months later, a ceremony was held in orbit to honor both crews. The survivors stood beside the rescuers as the commander of the fleet spoke. "There are rules and protocols," the commander said, "but there are moments when humanity must act not by rule, but by heart." The Horizon Dawn answered a call no one else heard, and because of that lives were saved. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, heartfelt. When the ceremony ended, the survivors and rescuers looked out the window at the vastness of space once more. The same darkness that had almost taken them now looked different, peaceful, endless and full of possibility. The captain turned to the pilot and said softly, "You changed what rescue means." The pilot shook their head. "We just reminded everyone what it means to be human." And in that moment it was clear. The mission had started as a simple exploration. It had ended as a story that would be told for generations, not about stars or ships, but about compassion, courage, and the power of answering a cry for help. They had been left to die. But humanity, in its purest form, had reached across the void and said, "You are not alone." That truth would outlive them all. After their return, life on Earth didn't feel the same. Everything looked familiar: blue skies, moving clouds, warm sunlight. But inside, they all carried something that couldn't be seen. The feeling of being forgotten, the fear of silence, the memory of a call that almost no one answered. In the first weeks, they stayed at the Orbital Recovery Center, going through checkups and debriefings. Doctors tested their bodies. Counselors spoke softly about mental health. Officials asked questions, trying to record every detail of what had happened. But sometimes, when the survivors tried to explain, words failed. How could anyone truly understand what it felt like to wait for death in a cold, drifting ship? One of the survivors said during an interview, "We thought the stars would be our grave. We stopped believing anyone would come." Then they paused, looked down, and added, "But someone did." That short clip spread quickly across media channels. People were moved not just by what had happened, but by what it revealed about humanity itself. The story of the Horizon Dawn became a symbol of hope. It reminded everyone that even in a galaxy filled with technology, empathy still mattered most. Back on Earth, public discussions began. Should the rescue protocols be changed? Should smaller ships be allowed to respond to distress signals even without official approval? Many argued yes. They said humanity couldn't call itself advanced if it ignored those in need. The Horizon Dawn's pilot was invited to speak at a hearing. They stood before a large council of officials and scientists, calm and humble. "I didn't break the rules," the pilot said quietly. "I followed something older than rules, the voice of conscience. If we lose that, we lose everything." Those words stayed with the council members. Some nodded silently, knowing it was true. Eventually, new regulations were written. A new clause was added to the rescue code. Any ship, regardless of classification, had the right to respond to a distress call if no official vessel could reach it in time. It was named the Dawn Directive. For the survivors, hearing about this change brought tears of pride. Their suffering had not been for nothing. Their story had changed the way humanity looked at compassion, but even as the world moved forward, the memories didn't fade easily. Some nights they woke up suddenly, still hearing the faint echo of alarms in their dreams. The silence of space had left deep marks in their minds. The darkness they once feared seemed to follow them, quiet but close. Yet there was also healing. They began to meet regularly, gathering every few weeks at the same spot near the spaceport. It was a small cafe overlooking the launch pads where ships came and went every day. They would sit together, drink tea, and talk about ordinary things: the weather, the news, small joys. Sometimes they laughed softly, remembering moments from the old ship, how the lights flickered, how they used to count hours between oxygen cycles, how they tried to stay awake to fight fear. They didn't talk much about the horror anymore. Instead, they talked about the rescue, about the day they saw the light of the Horizon Dawn appear through the darkness like a promise. Each time they met, they made sure to leave a message for the pilot. The pilot rarely joined public gatherings, always quiet, avoiding attention. But they sent short replies, thank you notes, little updates about the ship being repaired and ready for new missions. The pilot was never looking for praise. They believed the real victory belonged to everyone who still believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Months passed, then a year. The world had almost moved on, But the event remained part of human history. A monument was built outside the orbital dock, a tall, silver sculpture shaped like two hands reaching toward each other, one from space, one from Earth. At its base, the words were simple. Because we answered. During the unveiling, many of the survivors attended. They stood together silently, feeling the cool air against their faces. The sight of the monument made them emotional, but it also brought peace. It wasn't just about their survival anymore. It was about what humanity had learned. After the ceremony, one of them whispered, "We didn't just come back home. We brought something home with us, a reminder that kindness is still stronger than fear." The pilot of the Horizon Dawn watched from a distance, standing by the edge of the crowd. They didn't want to be recognized. They simply looked at the monument for a long time, then quietly turned away. There was another mission waiting, another unknown corner of the stars to reach. Later that night, when the sky was clear, one of the survivors went outside and looked up. The stars twinkled gently. For the first time in a long while, they didn't feel threatening. They felt like old friends watching silently from above. The survivor thought about the rescue, the first sight of the human ship breaking through the darkness. The voice over the radio saying, "Hold on, we're coming." That single moment had rewritten what hope meant. Every survivor carried that voice inside them. Some went back to their jobs in the fleet. Others left space entirely, choosing to live quiet lives on Earth. But all of them shared a common bond, an unspoken understanding that when everything falls apart, humanity can still rise through the act of caring. Years passed. Technology improved, colonies expanded, and new ships crossed further into the unknown. Yet in every training center and academy, the story of the Horizon Dawn became part of the curriculum. Recruits were taught not only how to fly or repair systems, but also why humanity must never forget compassion. In one of those classes, an instructor showed a picture of the Horizon Dawn's crew and said, "Machines can respond to signals, but only humans can respond to need." The students listened quietly, realizing that greatness didn't come from strength but from empathy. Meanwhile, the survivors kept in touch with the pilot through occasional messages. They never used formal words, just simple greetings, reminders to stay safe, and small stories about life back home. Each time the pilot would reply, "Still flying, still listening." That phrase became something special to them all. It was more than just a message, it was a promise. One day, years after the rescue, the Horizon Dawn was spotted again. It had completed another emergency mission, saving a group of miners trapped in orbit around a collapsing station. The same pilot was still in command. The same calm, human courage guided them. When the news reached the survivors, they gathered once more at their old cafe by the launch pad. They smiled and raised their cups, knowing that somewhere out there, the same ship that once saved them was still keeping watch. The youngest survivor said softly, "They didn't just save us back then. They saved the part of humanity we were starting to lose." No one disagreed. Outside the cafe window, a new ship was launching. Its engines glowed, lighting up the night sky. The sound of it echoed through the city. One of them watched the bright trail and whispered, "Every time I see a ship go up, I remember that call. I remember that someone cared enough to answer." The others nodded, and even though time had moved on, the bond between them and the crew of the Horizon Dawn remained untouched. It was something that couldn't fade, a living memory of courage and kindness written not in books, but in the hearts of those who had lived it. On the 10th anniversary of the rescue, a message arrived at Earth Command from deep space. It wasn't marked urgent. It was short, simple, and carried the same calm tone as before. Signal received. New distress call detected. Adjusting course. Still flying. Still listening. The message spread across networks again, and once more humanity felt that spark of pride. People remembered what the phrase meant. It wasn't about one ship or one event. It was about what it meant to be human. To care, to act, to keep faith even in the dark. And somewhere beyond the edge of known space, the Horizon Dawn glided silently between the stars, answering another call. Its lights shone bright against the black, carrying the spirit of all those it had once saved. Back on Earth, a survivor looked up at the sky that night and whispered with a faint smile, "We were left to die once. But they came. And because they came, we learned how to live again." The wind moved softly, and above, the stars seemed to shimmer a little brighter, as if they, too, remembered. Humanity had changed. The story had become part of who they were. And as long as there were voices crying for help, there would always be someone out there ready to answer. The Horizon Dawn's legacy was not about glory or medals. It was about something far simpler, something eternal. When someone needed hope, when someone called into the darkness, humanity would remember the words that started it all. Hold on. We're coming. And that promise would never be broken again. Years passed. The world changed. But the memory of that rescue never faded. The name Horizon Dawn became a part of human history, a symbol of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable will to help others no matter the distance. Children learned about it in schools. Teachers would play recordings of the faint signal that had once echoed through the void, the desperate call for help that had almost been lost forever. Then they'd tell the story of how one ship, one crew, had decided to go when no one else would. The classrooms would grow quiet, students staring at the screen in wonder. What made them do it? Someone would always ask. And the teacher would smile and say because they were human. And that's what humans do. Across generations, the message stayed alive. The monument by the orbital dock still stood tall, gleaming silver under the sunlight. Travelers passing through would stop to read the words carved into the base, because we answered. Some would take photos, others would simply stand there in silence, feeling a quiet sense of pride. The survivors of that old mission had grown older now. Some had retired to peaceful lives far from the chaos of space. Others worked in training centers, teaching new explorers how to stay calm, how to survive, and most importantly, how to listen when someone called for help. One of them often stood near the monument every year on the same day. They would bring a small bunch of white flowers and place them gently at the base. Sometimes a few visitors would recognize them and ask to hear the story again, and even after all those years, their voice would still tremble slightly when they spoke. We were drifting, they would say. We thought it was over. Then a human voice came through the static and said, hold on, we're coming. I can't explain what that moment felt like. It wasn't just hope, it was life itself. The visitors would listen, their eyes wide, their hearts quiet. And as the old survivor walked away, they would whisper to each other, that's them. That's one of the people who lived because someone answered. The Horizon Dawn itself had become a legend. The ship had completed many missions since that day. It had changed crews over time, repaired, upgraded, and even rebuilt in parts, but its name was never changed. The phrase still flying, still listening was painted in small letters along its hull. For generations, it continued its duty not because it had to, but because it represented something humanity refused to forget. One day, long after the original pilot had vanished into retirement, a group of young cadets was assigned to the Horizon Dawn. They were nervous and excited, eager to be part of something with such history. During their first briefing, their commanding officer stood before them and said, "You are not just flying a ship. You are carrying a legacy. Remember what this vessel stands for." Each cadet nodded, feeling the weight of those words. Their first mission was a long one, surveying distant colonies, far beyond the usual patrol routes. The stars stretched endlessly before them, just as they had for those who came before. As they traveled deeper into the unknown, one of the crew members sat quietly by the window, gazing into the dark. They had heard the old story since childhood, but now, being out here in the silence, they finally understood it. Space was vast, cold, and indifferent. Out here, the smallest act of kindness could mean everything. Weeks passed. Then one night, the ship's sensors picked up a faint signal, weak, distorted, almost gone. The crew gathered around the console. The message was broken, filled with static, but they could make out fragments, someone calling for help. One of them whispered, "It's just like the story." The officer looked at the display for a long moment, then gave the order, "Set a course. We're going." No one questioned it. No one hesitated. They moved together as if guided by something older than training, something that lived in every human heart. Hours turned into days as they followed the signal through the dark. The coordinates led them toward a small mining station on the edge of an asteroid belt. The station's lights were out, its systems failing. The people inside had almost lost hope. When the Horizon Dawn appeared on their scanners, the voices in the station broke into cries of disbelief and relief. "We thought no one would come," one of them said over the comms. The young officer replied softly, "Hold on, we're here." The same words that had once saved the crew so long ago were now being spoken again, carrying the same strength, the same warmth. The rescue was difficult. The asteroid belt made it hard to navigate, and the station's structure was unstable. But the crew of the Horizon Dawn didn't back down. They worked together, steady and focused. Every move was made with care, every risk measured with heart. Finally, after long hours of tension, they pulled the survivors aboard. The moment the door sealed and the airlock cycled, cheers filled the corridors. People hugged, cried, and thanked the crew again and again. One of the rescued engineers looked around in awe and said, "Wait, this ship, is this the Horizon Dawn?" The officer smiled quietly. "It is," the engineer's eyes widened. "The same one from the old story?" "Yes," the officer said. "And we're still listening." Those words spread once again through the networks carried by media channels, space stations, and civilian broadcasts. It was like history repeating itself. Another rescue, another act of human courage. People around the world felt something they hadn't in a long time, a deep shared sense of pride. Humanity had changed, evolved, built bigger ships and faster drives, but its soul remained the same. Compassion still led the way. After the mission, the crew of the Horizon Dawn returned home to quiet applause and heartfelt gratitude. The officer refused awards, saying simply, "We only did what those before us taught us to do." The rescued miners and engineers visited the monument not long after. They placed a new plaque beside the old one. It read, "Because they still listen." As the years turned into decades, the story of the Horizon Dawn became more than history. It became a tradition. Every new generation of explorers would learn its story before their first flight. They would listen to the old transmission recording, the faint voice saying, "Hold on, we're coming." And they would carry that message into the stars. The original survivors, now very old, often watched the launches from their homes. Each time a ship rose into the sky, leaving a bright trail behind, they would smile quietly. Once, during an interview near the end of their life, one of them was asked what kept them believing in humanity after everything they'd been through. They looked into the camera and said softly, "Because someone cared enough to answer. And if one person can do that, it means there's still hope for us all." Those words were broadcast around the world. They became part of humanity's shared memory. And so long after those who lived the story were gone, their spirit lived on. The Horizon Dawn continued its endless journey, answering calls across the galaxy. Its name became a promise, an unspoken vow that no voice, no matter how distant, would be left unheard. One night, far from any known world, a small distress signal blinked faintly in the darkness. It was weak, almost gone, but somewhere nearby sensors caught it. A ship changed course. Engines roared softly. The old phrase echoed once more through the black of space. Words that had outlived generations. Words that had become humanity's eternal message. "Hold on. We're coming." And through that call across the endless stars, humanity continued to prove that no distance was too great, no silence too deep, and no life too small to matter. Because as long as there was someone listening, no one was ever truly alone.